Good evening, I'm Xavier Salomon, and welcome to this episode of Travels with a Curator. This evening, we focus on the painting which was at the center of the exhibition, the Charterhouse of Bruges, Jan van Eyck, Petrus Christus, and Jan Vos, which took place at the Frick between September 2018 and January 2019. Here you see a view of the exhibition in the Cabinet Gallery at the Frick, with the painting by Jan van Eyck, which provided the center, the focus of this exhibition on the end wall. The exhibition was curated by Emma Capron, who is now the Associate Curator for Northern Paintings at the National Gallery in London, but who was at the time our Poulet Curatorial Fellow at the Frick, and she worked on this exhibition. And together in 2017, we traveled to Bruges, and so part of the Travels episode today will be about that trip in the footsteps of Jan Vos and the Charterhouse of Bruges. Bruges is one of the most beautiful cities in Flanders, in today's Belgium. It is well known for its medieval and Renaissance buildings, for its beautiful canals, and it is a great tourist destination today in Belgium. Here you see one of the wonderful views of the city. And it is an idyllic place with these wonderful canals with swans going along in them, and you can have a boat tour of these canals as you explore the city of Bruges. The center of the city is filled with monumental buildings, and these were, of course, many of the centers of the European world economy in the 14th and 15th century. Bruges was one of the best known cities in terms of its financial banking power. And it was really one of the most significant cities in Europe and in the Western world at the time, in the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance. And of course, this is a city that attracted banks and financial people from all over Europe. And this combination of Northern and Southern European people gathering in Bruges is exemplified in one of the most famous paintings by Jan van Eyck, which shows Giovanni Arnolfini, an Italian banker working in Bruges with his wife. And this is one of the great treasures at the National Gallery in London. And of course, Giovanni and his wife must have wandered the streets of Bruges pretty much as we do today, and seen many of the monuments there. One of the great figures in the history of Bruges and the history of art in Bruges is the painter Memling. And this is his monument in Bruges. And if you visit the city today, you can see many of his works in the city. This is one of them, the reliquary casket of Saint Ursula, entirely painted by Memling, and one of his great masterpieces. There are also other treasures in the city, artistic treasures like this, The Virgin and Child by Michelangelo, which is actually the only work by Michelangelo produced to go abroad. It was destined for Bruges when it was carved by Michelangelo, and it can still be seen in one of the churches in Bruges. But today, I would like to focus on Jan van Eyck. Jan van Eyck is one of the greatest artists, painters in the 15th century in Flanders, in Northern Europe. This, again, is the 19th century monument erected to Jan van Eyck in Bruges. And the fact that this monument stands in Bruges reminds us that most of Van Eyck's career was linked to the city of Bruges. For about 20 years plus, he worked and lived in the city. And the work we have at the Frick by Jan van Eyck was in fact painted for Bruges. There are two great works by Van Eyck that can still be seen in Bruges today. This is the portrait from the 1430s of his wife, Margaretha van Eyck, and it is this sort of extraordinary image of the woman Van Eyck lived with. And on a more grandiose size, the Virgin and Child enthroned with Saint Donation and Saint George and Canon Joris van der Pele, who commissioned this large work as a memorial in the Church of Saint Donation, where he was a canon. And of course, you see van der Pele on the right, kneeling with this extraordinary portrait, while Saint George, his patron saint, presents him to the Virgin and Child. The work at the Frick is a very late work by Van Eyck. We know for a number of reasons it must have been commissioned in the spring of 1441, probably after April, and Van Eyck died just a few months later in June of 1441. So this was completed probably by 1443, and it must be a work that was envisioned by Van Eyck. The underdrawing is by Van Eyck. He must have started it, and then it must have been completed by his very able workshop a couple of years after Van Eyck's death. This was acquired by the Frick and has joined the collection. And it's really the great work by Van Eyck that we have at the Frick. It shows the Virgin and Child enthroned in the middle, standing under a baldachin rather. Here she is, surrounded by this beautiful textile with the inscription Ave Gratia Plena at the beginning of the Hail Mary. And on each side there is a saint. On the right, Saint Elizabeth, set against this wonderful landscape of an ideal city, even though some of the buildings in the city are based on real medieval buildings from Van Eyck's time. For example, the church with the tall spire has been identified as St. Paul's Cathedral in London. But clearly here, as far as we know, there is no specific significance for that church appearing in the picture. But what you see in the foreground of this ideal city, of course, is a body of water with swans, very much what Van Eyck would have seen in Bruges. On the opposite side, instead, is Saint Barbara. Saint Barbara holds the palm of her martyrdom, and she stands in front of a tower, which is usually the symbol of Saint Barbara. She was locked up in a tower by her father, and so whenever she appears in Christian iconography, she's always accompanied by the symbol of the tower, in this case with a statue of Mars in it. The details of the picture, the textile, the palm, the architecture are absolutely wonderful. And this is one of the great glories of Flemish painting from the 15th century, this attention to detail, this incredible use of oil paint to represent these textures, these different types of materials. It's something that was generally loved by patrons all over Europe and the Western world. This painting includes also curious little details. So, for example, at the bottom of this capital on the left, hiding in the bushes, there is a man wearing a red hat. And we don't know why he's here, but this is one of the many details that you can look at carefully when exploring this picture. And there are many others as you look at every detail. And these are the sort of things that patrons in the 15th century would have delighted in looking at and discovering. This painting was commissioned by a man called Jan Vos, and we know quite a lot about Jan Vos. Here he is praying, kneeling in the painting made for him by Van Eyck. Jan Vos was born in Delft in Holland, but spent most of his life in Utrecht, where he was first a Teutonic knight, and Teutonic knights were Christian knights that went back to the Middle Ages, whose mission was to fight infidels, non-Christians, worldwide. By this point, by the 15th century, they were mostly dedicated to running hospitals in Europe. And later, Jan Vos in the 1430s becomes a Carthusian monk. He joins the Carthusian order in Utrecht and becomes a member of the Charterhouse of Utrecht. He is there until April 1441, when he is called to Bruges to become the prior, the head of the Charterhouse of Bruges, the Charterhouse of Genadedal. And Jan Vos moves to Bruges and lives there until 1450. So he is there for a few years as the prior, and in 1450 he returns to Utrecht to become the prior of the Charterhouse he had been mostly involved with. He is the prior at Utrecht until 1458, and he then retires because of ill health and dies at the Charterhouse of Utrecht, where he's buried in 1462. Jan Vos appears in another painting, which was also made for him, probably during the time while he was at the Charterhouse of Genadedal, and he is shown here again praying in front of the Virgin Mary accompanied by Saint Barbara, his patron saint, who was also one of the patron saints of the Teutonic Knights. This was painted instead by Petrus Christus, who was a pupil of Van Eyck. And it's a much smaller painting, and it's now in Berlin at the Gemälde Gallery. And you see it here together with the Frick painting. This is when they were shown together in 2018, 2019, and it's only the second time these two pictures were seen together. The first time was at the Metropolitan Museum in the late 90s in an exhibition on Petrus Christus. I think it was about 1998. Here instead, you see them at the Frick, the Van Eyck on the left, the Petrus Christus on the right, and you see how these pictures differ in size. The Petrus Christus clearly made as a private devotional work, the Van Eyck as a grander, larger size painting. The exhibition at the Frick brought together a number of works relating to these two paintings and to Jan Vos and his role as a Carthusian monk. So you see, for example, here in the foreground, a portrait on the right of a Carthusian monk. We don't know who he is, from the Metropolitan Museum, also painted by Petrus Christus, but presumably a monk at the Charterhouse in Bruges. There were also objects like a prayer bead in the upper right, but this manuscript, which is one of the few manuscripts with music surviving from the Charterhouse of Bruges. So it's a rare survival and a book that someone like Jan Vos and his fellow monks would have used in prayers at Bruges. So what is a Charterhouse? A Charterhouse, a Chartreuse, is the monastic complex where Carthusian monks live. The order was founded in the 11th century by Saint Bruno, and the first Charterhouse is the so-called Grande Chartreuse, the Great Charterhouse in the Alps, in the south of France, in the Alps. And here is an aerial view where you see that there is a church, there are various sort of complexes, buildings, but also cells around courtyards, which would have been the cells inhabited by the monks. And this is a model that is then repeated in a number of charter houses all over Europe in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. So to give you a few examples, this is a great charter house at Pavia in northern Italy, where you see the church in the background, and again, the cells around the courtyard in the foreground. This is in the south of Italy, and it's a very similar setup, and this is the Charterhouse of Padula, south of Naples. But there were charter houses also in larger cities. So few people may know that there was actually a charter house in London. And this is an image of the Charterhouse in London, which is now, what remains of it, is now open to the public. The Charterhouse of Bruges, like many charter houses adjacent to large cities, was actually built just outside the city. So what you see in this map from the 16th century is the center of Bruges in the lower right, and then you see the mills and the city gates around the body of water that surrounded Bruges. And on the upper left, you see the building of the Charterhouse. So it would have been surrounded by the countryside, but it would have been fairly close to the city center. This was built in 1318. It was founded then. And as I mentioned before, Jan Vos becomes the prior of this Charterhouse in 1441. So when I traveled to Bruges with Emma Capron, we went in search of what remains of the Charterhouse. And unfortunately, that is pretty much very little. So as you walk out of the city of Bruges, the gates are still very much there. With the body of water you have to cross to exit the city. But when you reach the site of the Charterhouse, it is actually now taken over by housing buildings. Modern housing buildings are in this not so rural anymore area in the outskirts of Bruges. And all that remains is the name of the street, which reminds us that that's where once the Charterhouse was. The Charterhouse was destroyed, in fact, in 1578 during the religious wars that affected this whole area of Flanders and the Netherlands, and it was demolished, not to be rebuilt. And later on, various other buildings were built on this site. And of course, as I said now, there are these housing buildings there. So when looking at the Van Eyck at the Frick, it brings us back into a world that physically doesn't exist anymore. The Charterhouse of Bruges was destroyed, and the exhibition was designed in a way to bring back to light this destroyed building. So again, today we're traveling to a specific building that doesn't exist anymore, even though Bruges is still filled with marvelous monuments from that time. The painting was created probably to be used eventually as a memorial to Jan Vos in the Charterhouse. So this was probably hanging somewhere and was attached to an indulgence. And an indulgence was a Christian, a Catholic system, effectively, where following the belief that souls would end up in purgatory after death, and purgatory was a sort of anteroom, effectively, to either heaven or hell. And so people would spend a certain amount of time in purgatory before moving, hopefully, to heaven. So it was believed that prayers for the soul of a specific individual would shorten the time of that soul's period in purgatory. So many people devoted complicated systems so that people in the future would remember them and pray for their souls in purgatory. And Jan Vos, no doubt, commissioned this painting from Van Eyck with that in mind. And so people would have prayed in front of this and would have effectively shortened his time in purgatory. Today, Bruges is still one of the greatest treasures in terms of artistic heritage of Northern Europe. And it is still an incredibly beautiful, well-preserved city. So even though the Charterhouse doesn't exist anymore, the rest of the city brings us back to Jan Vos's time and Van Eyck's time. And very little in general has changed from that time. So you still get a feeling of what the city must have felt like. But when it comes to the spirituality of Jan Vos and his beliefs, his religious beliefs, the painting by Van Eyck remains as a witness to that strong belief. So I hope when you travel to Bruges, you will also think of the Fricks Van Eyck. And I encourage you all to also look at our website, because there are lectures and more material on the exhibition, The Charterhouse of Bruges. Thank you for joining me this evening, and I look forward to seeing you next week.